Final video of chapter 17. I will not have gone through everything that's in the textbook that could be on the test in chapter 17 in these videos. So please do go back to the notes outlines that I'm providing for you to use with the book chapter in the textbook to go through more nuanced details of what I want you to know for the test, but also what you don't need to know or don't need to cover in this chapter because it's so dense. So we just talked about the Equal Pay Act of 1963. The next year, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And the Civil Rights Act is a very comprehensive piece of legislation. It includes regulations and laws around employment, but also around things like housing and education. Title VII is the part that deals with employment and compensation. So that's the part we talk about when we're talking about the Civil Rights Act in HR classes. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, race, color, religion, or national origin in any employment condition. So it creates a protected class for sex, race, color, religion, or national origin. Sex was created in the Equal Pay Act, but it only dealt with compensation. This is talking about more than compensation. It's talking about employment conditions like hiring, firing, promotion, transfer, and training and development. So it's not just compensation, it's much broader than that. After the Civil Rights Act, we actually add a few more laws that create other protected classes that might be affected in terms of compensation. So the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the ADEA, was passed to prohibit discrimination based on age. Sorry if you can hear my cat in the background. She wants to join in as well. This protected employees who are over 40. So it doesn't protect employees who are under the age of 40. And the reason that people over the age of 40 needed protection was really twofold. One is that for a lot of organizations, when they wanted to save money or had to reduce budgets, the first people they would tend to lay off were more senior individuals who were being paid more because they had more experience in that organization. And so that was an easy way to get rid of a lot of, money out of your budget if you needed to free up money. But what was happening is people were losing their jobs later in their careers, but then they were unable to find new work because a lot of people didn't want to hire someone who's so experienced for a lot of entry-level jobs that they had open, or didn't want to have to pay them somewhat similar amounts of money to what they made in their last job. And so it was really hard for them to find work as well, even when they were fired or were let go because of budget reasons. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and that prohibits discrimination based on disability. It's a lot like the Civil Rights Act in the sense that it's very broad. So it talks about things other than just employment, like housing, education, transportation, etc. But the provisions we specifically are talking about when we talk about HR is around making reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities and ensuring that we're not paying people with disabilities less than other employees for equal work. And then finally, we have the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act that was passed in, I think, 2009. And that redefined the statute of limitations from the Civil Rights Act for pay discrimination filings. So the Civil Rights Act says that employees have 180 days to file discrimination claims to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission when they think that they've been discriminated against. In compensation, it means in terms of compensation when we're talking about this. But the Civil Rights Act is defining the beginning of that 180 days as the time that decision was made to pay that employee less than someone else. Well, what happened to Lilly Ledbetter is she found out many years after she started working for Goodyear Tire that they were paying her less than men who were in the same position but had less experience and less education than she did. And so she actually won in court back pay for all the pay she should have been paid compared to what her male coworkers were being paid. But then when she got to the Supreme Court, they said, Goodyear's admitted they discriminated against you, but on a technicality, you don't win this case because your 180 days was up many years ago. And so you're not in the statute of limitations to file a claim of discrimination. So the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act says that 180 days starts every time an employee gets a paycheck. It starts the clock over. So that gives people more time to find out that they're being paid differently than other employees and potentially being discriminated against, and then gives them a window that restarts every time they get a paycheck to file a claim of discrimination. One important part of the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is what is legal discrimination? What does discrimination look like? And when we go to court, we can talk about two kinds of discrimination: disparate treatment or disparate impact. These are sometimes also called adverse treatment and adverse impact, but both of those are the same exact terms. They're both used in the court of law. We'll use disparate treatment and impact in this class because that's what the textbook uses. Disparate treatment means that an employer is applying different standards to different employees. So an example would be requiring women to have better performance than men to get promoted to a higher paying job. Disparate treatment implies that the employer is trying to discriminate against certain kinds of employees. So in this example, that they're discriminating against women on purpose. This was very common, 50, even 40 years ago, when your parents or grandparents were working. It's not as common now, and it's much harder to prove in court because you have to prove that the employer or the organization was trying to discriminate against employees. What's much more common is this other kind called disparate impact. This kind of discrimination is about the practices that are happening within the organization. In our class, it's going to be around compensation that ends up leading to a differential effect or different pay rates or different benefits for members of different protected groups. So like in my last job before I got a PhD, my employer used to do equity checks on pay, and I got pay increases because I was a woman who was being paid less than men with similar experience and similar education in the same job. And so they were trying to fix that. That's a disparate impact. There was some kind of compensation policy or decision making that didn't mean to make women earn less than men, but it ended up in that result. And so the organization had to fix it. You do not have to prove that an employer was trying to discriminate against any group in order to prove disparate impact in court. So it's much easier to prove in court, and it's much more common in workplaces today. We also have this other issue. We've talked about equal pay for equal work, but how do we know if there might be discrimination when there are actual differences in jobs? And so there are a few ways that either the Supreme Court has said are okay, or at least ways that you can prove that different pay rates for different kinds of jobs is somehow job related and should be legal. The first is in the green box here. Courts have upheld the use of market data to justify pay differences for different jobs. So this is when you usually pay an outside organization, but organizations can also do their own research to find out what are organizations in their industry or field paying for similar jobs. And a lot of organizations are doing this, and even more so, I would say, today than even 10 or 15 years ago. And because you're competing for the same employees, so you're going to try to pay at least similarly, if not more, if that's your market strategy, if that's the strategy, the compensation strategy that you want to use, you're going to have to use market data to figure out what are other companies paying. That's apparently very justified. The Supreme Court will take that information. And that is one reason that you can pay different amounts for different kinds of jobs in the organization. The blue box is another kind, and this is called comparable worth. So organizations, one way that organizations can figure out how much they should pay different kinds of jobs is determining what is the value of each job or the tasks that each job does to the organization. And we'll actually figure out how to do this when we talk about job evaluation, because that's the standard we use to determine comparable worth. And actually, we'll be doing that in a few weeks in our class. Essentially, what an organization does is say these kinds of skills or this kind of task is really important. So when these tasks are in a job, so this can be something like the main work of the organization. When people are doing the main work, they're going to get paid more than when they're not, and that's comparable worth. And there's a whole way to do this that's like part of the job evaluation process that we'll learn. And then, as I mentioned, many public employers are starting to use pay equity studies to assess the gender neutrality of their pay systems, not only to improve the systems, but also to correct inequities that those systems have created in the past. There's a couple of graphics here that I wanted to show you. These are much more up to date than what the book has to show some of the concepts the book's talking about in terms of pay discrimination. So this particular graphic is an earnings gap graphic, and it comes from 2023 from the Census Bureau. So they do these surveys called the Current Population Survey every year, where they survey Americans about different topics. So in this particular graphic is about the kinds of pay that people are taking home from their jobs. So the yellow bars are what women are being paid, and they're separated out by, the first bar is all races, so that's a mean of everyone. And then they're separated out by Asian, white, non-Hispanic, Black, and Hispanic. The red bars are what men in each of those races are getting paid on top of what women are getting paid. So in every single racial category, men are paid more than women on average. But as you can see, Asian women and men tend to make more than white, non-Hispanic, women and men. But they make more than Black, Hispanic men and women. And in fact, the lowest paying group on average is Hispanic women. I just want to point that out. I think this is much more, much easier to read and much more updated information than your textbook shows about earnings gaps. But there are some reasons for these earnings gaps. So let's go through some of those from Exhibit 17.14 in our book. There are lots of reasons that some groups get paid more than others, and some of them are job related and some of them aren't. So I'm going to start down in the lower left boxes in the labor market differences. There can be differences in demand and supply for specific skills. So for example, there's right now, risk management is very big in a lot of organizations. So IT skills that can help with risk management and preventing cyber attacks and cybersecurity is in demand. They'll pay more for those skills than someone who simply knows how to program to make games or make programs to do different kinds of tasks in the workplace. Because of those labor market differences, organizations are more willing to pay someone who can work on cyber threats and cybersecurity than they might be just for general programmers. So that specific skill set demands more money, even though those are both IT jobs. Moving around clockwise, firm and industry differences can also create differences in pay. So firms that are larger, so larger organizations generally can pay more. Organizations with much more sophisticated technology usually have more money, but also require skills that are related to working with that technology. And then those that have a pay strategy where they're trying to beat the market often are can create differences in what their employees are being paid compared to other industries or other firms in their industries. You can also have work or occupation differences. So if you have differences in the skill, efforts, and responsibility required in jobs, then that makes sense why you might pay people more. If they're more held accountable for more people, like they have more employees that they're supervising, or they have more projects or tasks they have to do, then that makes sense. As I also mentioned, working conditions can be another reason that you would have those differences. You can also have qualification differences. Ironically, more women have higher education than men, but men tend to, over their careers, have more experience than women because of the next box, work-related behavior differences. So women often have to make career life trade-offs that men don't to take care of children or have, because they have other caregiving responsibilities. You also can have higher turnover in some of these jobs, especially when women have to leave to take care of other family members. You can have performance differences and even the hours of work. Women are more likely to work part-time than men. And then finally, you can have union differences. Men are more likely to work in industries or in firms that have unions and are more likely to be represented by a union than women are, because a lot of unions are around trades and manual labor professions that are just have more men than women. So that means that they're more likely to get paid more when they're part of a union than when they're not. So what we can do with research is we can take people's pay and we can control for all of these factors. And even when you control for all of these factors, there's still a gap between men and women and people of color and white people. Those gaps that still exist after we've controlled for all of these factors is how we know discrimination is still happening. That difference is now just discrimination. There's actually no job-related reason that we can find that some people are being paid, men are being paid more than women generally, or people of color are being paid less than white people generally. We also have this phenomenon of the glass ceiling. Some of you may have heard of this before. This is the idea that as women move up into leadership positions, the higher they go, the harder it is for them to get into those positions. I'm using a graphic from Catalyst. This is an organization that collects information around different kinds of companies. They really focus on the Fortune 500. So those are the 500 largest companies in the US. And they collect information around pay, promotions, leadership positions, all sorts of things. And they're really looking at differences between men and women in different industries and different jobs. So in this pyramid, we have women are about half of the workforce. So they're 46.7% of the US labor force. And in fact, they're 51.5% of the management, professional, and related occupations in the workforce. That sounds great because isn't it management and professional occupations that we're talking about here? But as you move up into this pyramid, these are becoming like top leadership positions within organizations and specifically within the Fortune 500. So we've got executive officers. So those can be people like your executive marketing officers. You might have a chief HR officer, for example, those sorts of things. That's only 14.4% of those positions are women. Boards oversee CEOs and organizations. A lot of times they're independent. They're not necessarily employees within the organization, although the CEO can be the head of the board. Only 15.7% of the seats in the Fortune 500 boards are women. Then you go into the top earners. So people like chief financial officer, chief information officer, only 7.6% of those positions are women. And then when we go to the CEOs, the very cream of the crop of the Fortune 500, the people who get to make the most important decisions, only 2.2% are women. And in fact, this percentage has gone down over the last decade or so. It used to be about 4.5%. So the reason this matters is, one, women have more education than men, and many of them don't have those same kinds of breaks or don't work part-time during their careers. So the fact that only 2.2% are becoming CEOs of Fortune 500 companies means something's going on here as women are moving up in their careers. The other thing this is important is CEOs have a lot of influence, not only through the board, but because of the head of the organization in terms of policies around diversity, equity, inclusion, around compensation. How's the compensation system made? How are we going to compete in our industry? If women aren't in those seats of position, and actually the numbers are quite similar for people of color, then that means you're not getting a diversity of voices or diversity in strategies in terms of who's at the top and how they're influencing their organizations. And then finally, this is important because this can speak to why women might be making less than men as well, because CEOs are the top paid individuals in their organizations, and they're paid not just in cash, but also in things like stock, where they'll make money now, but definitely in the future on those organizations. If women are getting very few of those positions, it means women are going to make less than men generally because they're not getting to the highest paid positions within organizations. So how do we prevent some of these issues happening in our organizations, especially when we're thinking about creating or changing our pay systems as our strategies change in our organizations? Well, compliance managers, who can be people who are legal representatives for an organization, but they can also be HR managers and HR staff, have to be aware of these regulations. And if they're doing a really good job, if they're being very proactive, they can actually have some influence in what those regulations are and how they're enforced. So to be aware of those regulations, you'll want to join professional associations like the Society for Human Resource Management. In fact, our local SHRM chapter has been very helpful for me to learn what kinds of issues a lot of HR professionals are dealing with in terms of interpreting new laws, new legislation, and new regulations in their work. You can also review compensation practices and their results by keeping data in your organization. And we'll learn a little bit about that in this class. But that's why we have human resource information systems that have lots of different kinds of data, because then we can go through that data and see if people, for example, in different men and women, if they're being paid differently in your organization for very similar work, or are people of color being paid differently from white people for similar work in your organization. I also want you to keep in mind that fair treatment of all employees is the goal of a good pay system. If we have a pay system that seems fair to employees, we're more likely to have employees that are going to stay in our organization, are going to try to develop themselves over their careers to help the organization meet its strategy goals. But also, this is just good working practice. We want to work in places that are fair. And I want you to keep in mind, some of these laws and regulations might seem onerous in this chapter, but the goal for all of this legislation is exactly the same: to create fair workplaces for all employees. These laws and regulations don't do it perfectly, but it's at least an attempt for us to create those systems when the systems weren't being made in organizations in the past naturally.